Hall of Trials is coming to an end soon, but we still got a good 4 days of free unequipped to work with. Almost all of the top teams are using the comp I'll be showing, and it's definitely the highest scoring team overall. Do keep in mind that your runs probably won't look the exact same as mine due to differences in speeds on your units, but this should give you a good general idea of what to do. Also, I'll only be showing my stats in this video, but there will be an alternative build for the 4 units used with, at least for the speed parts, much more relatable gear. His GAither is much stronger than mine, but it is what it is. There's also going to be the general setup listed out in there as well. Starting off with Light Achates. For Light Achates artifact, I gave her Warhorn 10% attack for all allies. This plus her 8.4% attack for all allies is a solid damage increase for your GAither. Aside from that, her bulk is also one important thing because she's in the front slot. She'll be tanking a lot of damage from AUV. Just enough to live is good enough with whatever healing you're using. For speed, it doesn't matter too much. Make sure she's not too fast because you want to make sure she only takes at most 3 turns. Aside from that, whatever works best for you. For her sets, they don't really matter, since all she really needs is a bit of speed and some bulk. Next up, we've got GAither Aether. For ZE, the healing amount on his S2 is probably the most important one. His sustain's actually pretty integral to getting good setups with this comp. Artifact, Cruel Mischief is the best one, 30% damage increase. It's not a true 30% because we're getting a lot of other damage dealt increase sources in Hall of Trials, but it's still our best damage artifact. Call, just not really usable since we're not using any debuffs in this comp. Aside from that, for sets, Destruction's better than Double Torrent because of all the damage boosts we're getting. 2P set could be Torrent or Crit. My Torrent gear is better, so I'm using Torrent here. The next up is crit damage. We're going to be using an artifact on Achates that gives us crit damage buff rather, so 300 is what we would be aiming for. But that's what my gear allows for. Crit chance 85% because the boss is dark. And then for attack, you just want to stack this as high as possible while still maintaining at least 300% crit damage. And then I didn't Mola his S1 because he's in Grace of Growth. I'm not building a unit just for Hall of Trials, it'll be fine. So actually also, make sure if you have imprints, he's on his imprint concentration for 14% attack. Next up is ALots. This is not too easy to get. Spirit's Breath, ideally plus 30, gives you a 100% chance to proc. If you don't have plus 30, you'll need to reset more often because it won't be guaranteed to proc. Aside from that, the thing that matters most is just his speed. You want to be as fast as possible. You could slow him down a bit if it gives you better tuning. And then aside from that, you need a little bit of bulk to make sure he doesn't die. His 2 team attack slots are also pretty useful. So they'll give a bit of damage to your Aether. Just make sure your Aether is sitting in the top slot. He imprints your top and front slots, but the front slot doesn't really matter since that's where your tank is. Lastly, Achates. For Achates, her EE doesn't really matter too much. This is just the one I use on her normally. Whichever one you have is fine. Artifact though, if you have Amid Artifact, that's probably the best one. A chance for crit damage buff, not the highest proc rate, but it does greatly increase your damage. The CR push can be nice too. If you don't have that, any stat boosting artifact is probably fine unless you need extra healing. For stats, you also want to make her pretty fast. And then you want a good amount of bulk too to make sure she doesn't die. Aside from that, her stats don't really matter at all. So those are the general builds for this team. Your builds are going to look a little bit different. Some of you might be faster, some of you might have a bit less speed. You'll have to figure out whichever works best for you. This team has no unbuffable on it, so we're not able to make use of the second part of the exhaustion mechanic, where it increases by 40%. We have to use the first one, which increases by 5% for each hit that's not a dual attack. So 20 hits in order to get it into the next phase. This means that our tunings are going to be pretty tight, but there are ways to make it work. And again, I'm going to be doing a bunch of stuff that's specific to my run. Your runs are probably going to look different. Now let's take a look at an actual run. So this run, since we have no unbuffable, like I mentioned, is going to focus largely on trying to get as many hits in as possible. This also means that, unless you absolutely need to, you should avoid using any non-attack skills, which includes healing skills that aren't GAither's S2. You can see here, we're just slamming a bunch of S1s. And then even when GAither's turn's coming up, we're not even going to use S2 because we can still wait until Euphine actually uses her S2. We're going to use S3, and this is specific to my run because I need it to hit a certain cycle later on. And now that Euphine used her S2, Achates is going to use her S3 here. And then after this, we're not going to be doing any more healing or non-attack skills until after she uses her S3. Now Euphine uses her S3. I'm going to Achates S1 the egg here because we don't want to push her into break too fast. This is another specific thing to my setup where ALots S3 so he doesn't get CR push for his S1 so we can hit a certain cycle later. GAither S2 to heal, and then we're just going to use her S1 here. And now more setup for better phases. We're going to push GAither ahead of IHA so that since IHA is bringing us into break, we don't want GAither to move right after her. Achates is going to heal us all here, and this also gives us better timings on the fan procs. And now we enter break phase. You're just going to spam non-attack skills here, because you will only have 8 hits, and you want GAither to be doing all of the hits. Also, you want to make sure that you don't get any dual attacks here, because the S1 going into break phase, and also GAither will have an S1 coming up soon. If those dual attack, those do count as hits, so you lose out on 1 hit of damage. There is one decision you do have to make, aside from just spamming S2, which is who do you S2 with Light Achates? Fire Achates is generally a good choice, because it'll help her keep up with ALots, and you can get the Amit artifact procs in time. So the reason we see our push GAither will be coming up in a couple of turns, where I think on this next turn here, GAither is going to just barely be ahead of ALots, and this gives us better timings later on in the run. More non-attack skills like usual. This S3 doesn't do anything since we have no debuffs. And here GAither is just barely ahead of ALots. You can see it's only by 4%. This is what the GAither S3 at the start of the run and the ALots S3 to avoid using S1 was for. This sped GAither up and slowed ALots down enough for GAither to cut. And this is a very nice turn because this S2 we're going to put on ALots for tuning purposes later, but it also pushes him to 100% and then he pushes GAither to 100%. So now Light Achates, GAither, and ALots have no speed RNG relative to each other. Achates does still have a little bit since we haven't managed to push her to 100% yet, and it does affect my run in a very small spot in phase 2, which you'll see in a bit. I haven't figured out how to get rid of that yet, but it's minor enough that I don't really care. So here, everyone else is going to spam S1, and Achates and GAither will do the bare minimum of healing we need. Achates will S3 here, and then after this, we're not going to S2, because since GAither's S2 is a big enough heal, we can get away without using the non-attack skill and put more hits into Euphine instead. So we're going to keep on S1ing here, and then GAither's going to S2, and then now we can just spam S1s until Euphine uses her S2 again. So this turn is the one I mentioned has a little bit of RNG on it. You can see Achates is only 1% ahead of Light Achates. So with really bad speed RNG, if Achates rolls really low rather on her base speed RNG, and Light Achates rolls high, there is a chance that Light Achates goes before Fire Achates, and that kind of ruins my run. We're going to heal up before Euphine uses her S3 so we don't die. One more ALots S1, and it's time for us to start setting up for the next down phase. So after AFE uses her S3, we're going to try to push people into the right spots. We're going to push ALots up here, because since we don't want to use it on attack skill, we're going to use GAither's healing instead. ALots is going to push GAither up, and we're going to S2 to heal. And going to push GAither up again to give him better timings, make him move before Light Achates, since Light Achates is bringing us into break phase again. And then here we're going to push up Light Achates so we have 8 turns. You can see Yuffie's at 80%, she gets 10% CR for each turn you take. If we were 1 turn slower, then she would push to 100%, and if she does hit 100%, it will count as a turn even if you push her into break phase. So this would have pushed her into 7 turns if she was at 100%, and she would have taken a turn. Aside from that, we start with S3 here because GAither's about to die. And then from here on, it's pretty much the same thing. We're just going to keep on spamming non-attack skills. And then our Light Achates S2s are going to go into Fire Achates, because Fire Achates is a bit further behind here than she was in Phase 1. And we need to make sure that she's getting the fan procs in time. Okay, so coming up here is an important turn. ALots is just barely ahead of GAither by 1%, so we're not even going to S2 him. I'm going to S2 Achates instead for tuning purposes. Do remember that we synced up their speeds earlier near the end of Phase 1, so this is 100% consistent. ALots will always be ahead of GAither here. We can push up GAither here, and we'll see that he's just barely ahead of Light Achates. Again, since we synced up Light Achates speed with GAither as well at the end of Phase 1, that's also 100% consistent, and it'll always happen like that. So Phase 3, the first half of it at least, goes pretty much the same as Phase 2. Achates uses S3, GAither will S2 in a little bit, and then we're going to wait until Yuffie uses her second S2, and we're going to Achates S3 again. No need to use Achates S2 because we're not under any threat of dying. S2 to heal, and I'm just going to let it auto because it's just S1 spams until her second S2. That ALots duel gave him extra CR that he wouldn't normally have. It's probably not too important, but just to be safe, if that happens and you get a bad ALots duel, I'd like to just S3 to remove the extra CR he got. So Yuffie S3 for the last time here, and we're going to start setting up. So I'm going to push up Achates. And then Achates is going to have to S2, S3 here so we don't die, because we have to tank an S2 after this as well. Push up GAither so we can heal. And then once Achates takes her turn after this, we're going to use S3 as well to heal. A lot of the pushing being done here is just to set up better turn orders in the last down phase. So this is probably going to look very different depending on what your speeds are. You might have to do a bit of testing to find whatever works best for you, or you can just roll with it and see how it goes. So we push up Achates here. Now we push up Light Achates, who's going to push up Fire Achates. And we push up Light Achates one more time after this, and we're going to be ready for the third break phase. So the boss does get greatly increased attack once you hit 0 turns, so it's not exactly 20 turns, it's more like 19.5%. Same as before, we're going to be spamming skills. One thing here is that you do want to end this run with S2 available at a specific turn, so you're going to want to S2 or S3, depending on what your setup ends up allowing for. I'll explain the Achates S2 turn as it comes up. So I'm going to keep on pushing Achates here to let her keep up with ALots speed, so she can apply fan properly. Our fan is not proccing as usual, but all of these GAither turns, except for that one S1 back in phase 1, are going to be with a crit damage buff if fan would actually proc. That's the only turn that we're missing crit damage buff for in the run, and since it's in phase 1 and only on his S1, which is his weakest skill, it's not that much of a deal that we're not going to have crit damage buff on that turn. Finally get a fan proc here. So even though we had the 99% thing there, where ALots cut GAither by just 1%, just for tuning purposes, because I know it works, I just push GAither to the 100%. If you want, that's a good opportunity to push Achates as well if you need to. So here, our fan is a proc again, as usual. And this turn coming up is the Achates S2 turn, because Achates S2, you gotta remember, reduces skill cooldowns by 1 turn, and GAither's S2 is a very short cooldown. So we can just S2 him here, and instead of using S1 the last turn, you get an extra S2 in for a bit of extra damage. It is possible to do that on the end of phase 1 and phase 2 as well, using Achates S2 on GAither for an extra S2. It would change your tunings a lot, mainly GAither won't have S2 available and Achates won't have S3 available, so that is something to keep in mind. Overall, we did score 39 million with pretty bad fan proc RNG, so this is still a solid run. I'd also say my GAither is not very well geared. I can only hit 6k attack, which isn't a lot relative to the other ones I've seen, but that's just life. I've said this several times, but your run's probably going to look a little bit different, or a lot different, unless you have literally the exact same speeds as me. You're going to have to do a couple of tests if you're trying to push super high numbers just to see what tunings work best for you. If you're just trying to push top 5%, you could probably run this comp in any sort of form and it would be fine. You'll also notice that my top score, the one that I got almost 46 mil with, is a lot higher than the shown run, even though that was pretty much a perfect run with bad fan RNG procs. Fan RNG procs aren't going to cover that almost 7 mil difference. It's a bit complicated to explain why that happens, so I'll probably try to put something out tomorrow or the day after, because I need time to set it up. But until then, I hope this helps anybody who's trying to push.